In this video, let's continue on with our discussion on Python classes. So I showed you earlier how to create a class and how to create the init method. I also showed you earlier and explained in more detail the meaning of self when we assign it to methods. So now let's expand on our discussion and talk about creating additional methods in our class. So we have this class, but it really doesn't do very much. All we do at this point is we create instances of the class, and then we just bind the arguments that we pass in as attributes of the class. So in this current form, it's acting as sort of a complicated dictionary that basically we can do router1.platform and get this value, and we can do router1.IP address and get this corresponding value. So it's not really helping us in any meaningful way over what we can create in alternate ways in Python. Now, what if we start adding new methods? So let's create a new method, and let's say we're going to call this method say hello, and we'll say print hello. So whenever we call this method, all it's going to do is print the message hello. And if we went down here and we said print router1 say hello, and I'm going to go ahead and get rid of, comment out my breakpoint, that it's just going to execute. Oh, and I actually don't need to do it this way because it does the print statement in the method. So here I create my object. It is an instance of network device. I pass in my arguments. So, and I'm going to get rid of this print statement. And then here I call the method that I created. Now notice the syntax on the method. It looks basically exactly the same as a Python function, except it's embedded, it's indented underneath the class. We have the same naming convention as Python functions, so all lowercase. Use the underscore as a word separator. Then notice the first argument that we pass in is going to be the reference to the object itself. So we use this self argument. And I explained that in quite a bit of detail in an earlier video. So now if I go ahead and execute that code, and I need to just comment that out because right now, one second, I don't have the Python that had IPDB installed. So I just get into the right Python, and there you can see that we see our hello message get printed out to the screen. So we've created a new method. Now you can notice at this point that I'm actually not using anything in self. So I pass in a reference to the object, but I don't actually use anything that's in the object. What if we created a new method and we actually use something in the object? So we can say this is an F string, and we're going to say IP ADDR, and we'll say equals self.IP address. So notice we didn't have to pass in the IP address. There's no references to the IP address in the method's arguments. We can just reference anything that's been bound to the object, and in our init method, we bound the IP address that we passed in at object creation. We bound that to the IP address attribute. So since we're passing in a reference to the object, we can now use the things that are bound to the object. So we can say self.ip_addr, and we can print it out. And this is just using Python F strings. So if I then call another method, and I'll just say, change this to say IP. Okay. And we'll go ahead and execute that code. You can see it's printing out the IP address. The IP address that's bound to that argument, to that attribute of the object. And we could create a third method and say, call this say platform. And once again, we are not passing in any sort of platform argument. We are just going to retrieve it from the object. So we could do the following, and then we could call the say platform method. So we're creating the object here, we're calling the methods, and we're retrieving things that we bound earlier to the object. Now, you could also add things to the object as you want to. So if I'll do this with IPython. So the -i argument just causes it to drop into the interpreter shell after it executes. So this is going to leave the context where I have the router1 object still in creation. So I could say router1 say hello. I can call that method. Notice when I have the double parentheses at the end of it, I'm actually invoking the method. Whereas if I forget the double parentheses, it's just making a reference to the method. And I could say IP and print out the IP. Now you can also bind new attributes to the object. So if I wanted a new attribute, let's call it username, I can just assign them to the object as I choose. So I could say admin, and I could say router1.password equals whatever. So, and then you can actually access those later. And we could do these potentially in methods as well. So we could actually set the username, we could set the password in some methods. And obviously you can see we can also, once we've set them, we can also retrieve those attributes. So methods are pretty straightforward in Python. It's basically just like creating a function that's embedded inside the class. So here's our structure, class, the name of our class. We now have 4 methods. We have our init method, where we're binding the arguments that we pass in to the object itself. And then we have 3 other methods that we created that do various things that we desire. Each one of these, as the first argument, has a reference to self so that we can retrieve and use the object as part of our methods.